Welcome to KYNDversation, a space for sacred dialogue, honest reflection, and deep listening. I'm your host, Kendra Frazier. KYNDversation was born from my own inner dialogue, my journey of spirituality through life's unfoldings, questions, and becoming. Along the way, I discovered something essential, that transformation often happens not in isolation, but in conversation. In this podcast, I sit with people from diverse faith traditions, spiritual paths, and lived experiences to explore one central question. What does devotion mean to you? And how does your relationship to the sacred shape your life? My hope is that each conversation becomes a light post for those who feel challenged, disconnected, or searching for belonging. And that through our shared reflection, you might find courage, clarity, and deeper connection to yourself. Wherever you are on your journey, you are welcome here. Welcome to KYNDversation, where every conversation is a sacred practice. Together we explore the stories of people of faith and no faith across fields and religions, and the wisdom that awakens their souls. Because of their shared stories, we are invited more deeply into who we're becoming. In this space, we believe that the deeper we know ourselves, the more fully we encounter the divine. I'm your host, Kendra, with a Y, not with an E, so let's have a KYNDversation. Today's guest is Reverend LeDayne Polaski. Reverend LeDayne is a faith-rooted justice leader with over 30 years of experience building peace, strengthening communities, and advancing the common good. She has served as executive director of Mecklenburg Metropolitan Interfaith Network, also known as MeckMIN, since 2019, guiding interfaith collaboration across Charlotte, North Carolina, and surrounding areas in pursuit of belonging, equity, and shared responsibility. Before joining MeckMIN, LeDayne spent 21 years with the Baptist Peace Fellowship of North America, concluding her tenure as executive director. She began her vocational journey in congregational life as minister of youth at Myers Park Baptist Church, grounding her leadership in formation, relationship, and care. A graduate of Furman University and Duke Divinity School, LeDayne is trained in conflict transformation through American Baptist Churches USA and fundraising and nonprofit leadership through Hope Manifest and Duke University. Her work spans program development, conflict transformation, anti-racism and trauma-informed training, public speaking, writing, and coalition building across ecumenical, interfaith, and multicultural contexts, locally and globally. Let's welcome LeDayne Polaski. So how are you arriving today, LeDayne?
I'm great. I'm coming off of a 6-week sabbatical, which included a 2-week trip with my family to Hawaii. And I think if you spend 2 weeks in Hawaii, you're contractually obligated not to complain for the next 6 months.
I love that. Was this your first time in Hawaii?
It was. So my husband had been to like 49 states. This was his 50th. So that was a big deal. Wow. And it was the first time for all of us. And it was lovely, but it was lovely in a way I wasn't expecting. Like I was just expecting tropical island. I wasn't expecting magnificent mountains. So it was kind of cool. I mean, it was cool in lots of ways, but one of the ways was like, it was kind of unexpected.
Okay. I love that it was mountainous in a way that it wasn't expected. Do you have a most memorable moment from the trip at all?
Oh, goodness. There were lots.
I believe it.
We did go to the top of Mauna Kea, and which, depending on how you measure, is the highest mountain in the world. Like if you start from underneath the ocean, and we watched the sunset and then did some stargazing. And it was really interesting because the guy who leads these trips like does them, 5 or 6 times a week. And he was really disappointed because the moon was pretty bright. And he's like, oh, you're not seeing a lot of stars, but it was way more stars than we see in urban Charlotte. Mm-hmm. And And then it was also super cool. According to him, it's the only place in our hemisphere that you can see both like the Big Dipper and the Southern Cross.
Huh.
And even then, it's only like 2 months out of the year. So that was kind of cool to see this sort of stargazing thing that's very few people get to see. So that was a cool moment. There were lots of great moments.
Mm-hmm.
We also just loved like seeing birds and plants and animals that don't occur in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
So that was fun too.
Oh, that sounds like a wonderful time. I'm glad
It
you
was
had
great.
2 weeks away. You
It was
deserve
really
it.
lovely.
You do good work. Our paths crossed when you were the executive director at the North America Baptist Peace Fellowship.
Mhm.
And I'm so glad that they crossed here in Charlotte once I moved back. So I'm interested, LeDayne, in when you think about your early years, what
Mm.
moments in your life kind of speak to how you got into this work of justice and anti-racism and peace building?
That is a great question. And I will tell you a story that I haven't shared with a whole lot of people. I grew up in Greenville, South Carolina, and I think I must have been 5, 6, 7. And we were driving one day. My mom was driving, and there were these little hand painted signs, and I could see that they were really upsetting my mother a lot, but I didn't know what they were. And so finally, I said, "Mommy, what is KKK?"
Mm.
And so there was a rally being planned, and then quite accidentally, we just happened to be driving home um, in the evening that the rally was happening. And again, like I was just a little kid, so my memory is just like this gigantic fire and men in robes and hats, and I actually um, asked my parents about this just a couple of years ago to say, did that really happen, or was that just some like nightmare thing I dreamed up? And they're like, no, 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 it really happened. So that's one of those moments of like realizing like, oh my gosh, like this thing that I think of, like, I guess when I got older, it was like described as history. And yet I was like, no, no, I remember seeing it uh, when I was like 7 years old. Um, and so that's like a moment, I think. One of the stories I often tell in interfaith work is basically how absent interfaith was in my growing up. Greenville was still a relatively small city at that point, and not very diverse. And so often, especially when I'm working with students, I say, I'm like the most unlikely person to be doing this work, because like growing up, I can remember 2 Jewish friends and 1 Catholic friend, and then 1 friend who I think was probably Hindu, but we never talked about it. And so there's both like, it's kind of like the push and pull, I guess. Like there are things that were present in my childhood
Mm.
that kind of propelled me, but also some things that were missing that I look back and think, wow. And I often tell students when I'm doing trainings, like I had my first truly interfaith conversation where I was talking to somebody of another faith, and the faith was part of the conversation when I was in seminary. And I still remember it to this day. I went to Duke Divinity School, and I have no memory of how this conversation happened, but I was talking to an undergraduate student who was Muslim, and it was Ramadan, and he was sharing that he was frustrated because he had been fasting so long that his body had gotten used to it, and it didn't feel hard to him anymore.
Mm.
And he probably forgot that conversation the next day. I've remembered it for like 40 years because it was the very first time I ever had a conversation with somebody across an intentional conversation with somebody across faith lines.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been an interesting both and for me, like that there were things that were important,
Mm-hmm.
and also things that were just not there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for highlighting these moments. So we have you at 5 or 6 years old that's encountering these signs, riding with your mom, that talk about this Klan meeting that's happening in Greenfield, South Carolina. We have these friends who are Jewish, who are Catholic, maybe of another faith. Did you say?
I think she was probably Hindu. And here's what I say: like, there was this point where we had a school trip and we went to McDonald's afterwards, and I just remember her getting the fish sandwich and me thinking, oh, okay, right. But like, I had no language, no skills for having that conversation at that time. And I often think back, like, how lonely her existence had to be in, my high school, where she was such a dramatic minority in my high school. And so yeah, I often think back with regret. Like, I really wish that I'd had a MeckMIN in my life to make it possible for me to have that conversation. That at that point I was just utterly incapable of even imagining, much less having.
I think most of us are, who grow up in traditional religious spaces, because our religions can keep us very insular in terms of just being with our own religious communities. So I'm wondering for you, LeDayne, because I would definitely want to talk about the work of MeckMIN and the incredible work that it does around interfaith dialogue and advocacy here in Charlotte and beyond. But I'm also interested in how you move from being a student at Duke Divinity School, matriculating through seminary, to even opening up your mind enough to say, I want to begin to have these conversations with people of other faiths. Like, this is important to me. Like, what type of spiritual movements did you have while you were in seminary that or outside of seminary that brought you to this work of interfaith?
Yeah, let me actually step back and talk about an experience that happened when I was in high school. So I have this like very interesting both and childhood. So from the time I was a baby until the time I was about 7, we were very much a church family. I grew up Southern Baptist. We were at church on Wednesday nights. We were at church on Sunday mornings. We were at church on Sunday evenings. And so that was until I was about 7 or 8 years old. So kind of a real grounding in sort of traditional conservative Christianity. And then my parents had a falling out with the church and were absent from church for decades. My dad actually never went back. But my mom has finally kind of reconnected, like in her 70s. But it's, relatively recent. So then I was like not in church at all. And then in high school, I dated someone for a couple of years who was very involved in his Methodist church. And so I started going back to church with him. And that church the South Carolina United Methodists have this amazing program still going on today called Salkehatchie Summer Service. And it's a program where adults go in and they identify the homes of people living in poverty that could benefit from some very basic repairs, like that a team of high schoolers could be capable of. And then, you go in and you work for a week in the summer in South Carolina on somebody's house. And the first year I did it, the house, if you had driven by this house, you would have sworn nobody had lived there for 20 years. It was crumbling down. It was a little wooden house with a tin roof, no electricity, no water, and the huge holes in the roof, huge holes in the porch. And so we did a lot of improvements over the course of a week. But it was and I stayed in touch with that family. It was an older couple who happened to be keeping their grandkids for the summer. I stayed in touch with them for several years afterwards. But the real transformation for me was like, I had just never seen poverty like that. I grew up working class. I know what it was like to have weird meals at the end of the month because my parents' paycheck had run out. And I had friends who probably lived in even more challenging circumstances, but I'd never seen anything like that, where, they're keeping their 2-year-old grandson for the summer and there are holes in that porch he could have just fallen through. And no electricity, no water. Like, it's South Carolina, it's hot. And so first, like, I just never seen anything like that. It was a dramatic, eye-opening thing. But also there was this really amazing thing where we were actually responding, and that was a really powerful experience. And the it's a Christian organization, a Methodist organization, and so, like, in the evenings we would reflect on what we'd been doing. Looking back, I would call that theological reflection. I would not have had that language when I was 16 years old, but and those two things together, like, kind of this incredibly eye-opening experience, and this sense that I was doing something, however small, fixing holes in the roof, fixing holes in the porch, doing just basic repairs, and communicating to these people that they mattered. So, like, those things together kind of set the trajectory for kind of where I've gone since then. And then, as far as, like, how I started moving into being interested in crossing lines of difference, the church I attended when I was in seminary, which is Watt Street Baptist in Durham, was just this amazing place. It was the first Southern Baptist church to ordain a woman.
Wow.
It had been kind of on the forefront of the white Christian response to the civil rights movement. And so that was a really great experience for me as well, to just sort of be grounded in that for 3 years. So those are kind of the things that sort of set me in that direction. And then, honestly, like, connection to some of the larger Baptist groups, including the Alliance of Baptists and the Baptist Peace Fellowship and Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, that just kind of helped me see a bigger world and connect to people. And then, for me, at least, I guess there's nothing magic about getting to know people who are different than you are. Some people respond to that in a very different way. But for me, once I started having, friends and connections across these lines, like, it was just really compelling to be involved, to do my little part.
I love that you've placed yourself in intentional spaces to have conversations across differences. And I want to name that proximity matters in terms of bringing down the stigma of anything, whether we're talking about mental health, whether we're talking about having these conversations across faiths. Proximity matters. And we have to be intentional about crossing the lines if we want to get an opportunity to know people who are different from us. So thank you for naming that. When it comes to the work of Interfaith specifically, LeDayne, what have you had to let go of? What have you had to embrace to continue to push forward in the work of Interfaith? Because it's not easy work.
It isn't easy. And I will say, I'll be super transparent. So, I mentioned being welcoming and affirming, and how that had been and is, like, an incredibly important thing for me. I had to send an email today to somebody who reached out to me to say it's an organization in town that wants to do some partnership. And I said yes. And just let me make sure you understand our context, which is that in a widely interfaith setting, people are coming down on issues of sexuality in very different places. And I said, we are committed to dignity for all people and inclusion for all people. But the truth is that not all the members of our network are welcoming and affirming. I suspect most of them are welcoming. And I have never had an experience where anybody was acting in ways that were exclusionary or unkind. But the reality is, some of them are not affirming. And that was a big thing for me. And to think through, like, okay, what does this mean? What does this mean for me? What does it mean for our LGBTQ members, right? Many of whom are very active. And that's that is a thing to give up the reality of being in a situation where everybody agreed with me, to be in a space where it's like it's an active conversation. That's something big. And when I talk to folks who are part of the LGBTQ community, I try to be honest about here's what we are. Like, I am going to absolutely expect that you're going to be treated with respect. And please do let me know if that ever does not happen. But you might have a conversation with somebody who, for reasons of faith, is not affirming. So it's things like that. I think it's when I loved my little Baptist niche where everybody agreed with me. I like plugging myself back into that Baptist niche now and then where everybody agrees with me. Our little particular slice of Baptist life. Yes. And it's a lot of work to also put myself in spaces. You do this too, of like maybe being the person who's having a conversation with somebody who hasn't ever thought about this before, or isn't part of an affirming group. Or it's kind of like me back in seminary having my very first conversation with a Muslim, right? I think there are folks who come to MeckMIN events and have their very first conversation with somebody from whose sexuality doesn't line up with theirs. And so it's a challenge. But I also feel like, it's a space where transformation can happen because we are coming together. I mean, there are fewer and fewer places where conversations like that can happen, where you can sit at a table and say, I don't think about it that way, but I'd love to hear why you do. And I've been really heartened by the ways those conversations have gone at MeckMIN meetings, where people, are free to say, this is how I was taught, or this is how I think, or this is how I struggle with this scripture. But the conversations are respectful and curious. And I've seen some really lovely conversations come out. But there are times when I was like, man, I miss that place where I could just say, just assume that everybody was going to be on the same page with me.
Thank you for naming that. And I think that is where we are in our world, particularly in the United States. When I think of this 250th birthday that America just had, and what democracy means now, what religious freedom means now, given who is in office and in general, right? I had a roundtable discussion that Interfaith America hosted at Ebenezer a few weeks ago. They're doing these, and I'll definitely be talking to you about it offline, but they're doing these roundtable discussions with each faith that is in their sphere about how each person sees democracy, religious liberty, and freedom at this time. And we had a great conversation. For me, it was Black preachers and theologians from different denominations having this conversation. But what struck me is the necessity of interfaith dialogue and intrafaith dialogue when it comes to pushing the needle on how we're speaking across differences when we don't agree with each other. How are we making room to have respectful dialogue and openness to be able to say, Kendra, I don't agree with you being gay. Not that that is anybody's place to agree with me or not agree with me with being gay, but that's their opinion. And because I am where I am in terms of my own development, like, it's okay. I'm not looking for you to agree with my sexuality. I'm looking for you to agree with my humanity. Right. Which for me is a different thing. So I'm wondering for you, LeDayne, when it comes to the significance of interfaith work, why do you think it matters to the democracy that we live in now, and even to in the local community of Charlotte, Mecklenburg?
Well, that's huge.
I know.
We actually have a grant from the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations that funds this program we call Potlucks for Pluralism, which is a opportunity for 5 local students from 5 local colleges and universities to get together a couple of times a semester across lines of faith and to have deliberate conversations. And Arthur Vining Davis funds that in part, like it says directly on their website, something along the lines of, a functional democracy is not possible if people don't understand the basics of one another's faith. And I do think that's huge. And I, you know, on some level, just in that really simple idea of like, if a political leader stands up and says, theoretically, you know, there's no place for Muslims in this country, and you don't in fact know any Muslims, you might find it easy to believe that. But you know, if you're at a place like MeckMIN where you're sitting and you're breaking bread with people and you're sharing their lives and you've held their kids and you've been in their homes and they've been in yours, you know, it's a lot harder to say, oh yeah. So part of it is just as basic as that, like that when we know each other, especially if we can go to some depth of knowing each other, it's just so much harder for political leaders to lie to us about what other folks are like. And I also think that, you know, there's some really interesting writing. I won't get it all correct. I'm not a scholar, but saying that, you know, what we're trying to do in this country of having a diverse multi-faith democracy, it's just not what the history of the world has looked like, right? That there have obviously been other diverse civilizations, but many of them had like a central authority that was saying, this is what we're going to do. Like Rome was a diverse empire, but in part because the Roman Empire said, this is the way we're going to do it. And like, you get no choice about how this is going to go down. This idea of having a very diverse, in lots of ways, country that's also a democracy, it's kind of an experiment that we're still in the middle of. Like, is it possible? And so I think interfaith dialogue, interfaith relationships are incredibly important as we try to continue to make that reality, you know, make our democracy a reality. And so to me, it ties in completely. It's just, and I often say to people, like when I say that, I think sometimes it's not that you or I need to become experts on Hinduism or Sikhism. We couldn't, right? I mean, we're maybe not even experts on Christianity. Right. But what we can do is to be conversant enough to know, like, well, how do these faiths shape people? How do they shape them to act? How do they shape them to think? What kind of people does it create them to be? And yeah, how do we manage together? I will say, like, I've had multiple conversations with people who come from maybe a tradition in which they were educated that this group of people is not acceptable or that group of people is not acceptable. And often the conversation I have with them, which is the conversation I have with myself, right? Because like I'm not immune to those ideas. It's like, well, what kind of people does it shape them to be? And I remember very specifically having a lunch with a very sweet member who was, because of his relationship with MeckMIN, kind of encountering a group of people that he had been taught he shouldn't have a relationship with. And sitting at lunch and me saying, tell me what you see of their lives, right? And fine, you think theologically very differently than they do. I do too, as a matter of fact. But what do you see them doing? How are they living their lives? And I think that was really helpful for him. And I've had that kind of conversation multiple times with people. It's like, how do you see it shaping them? What is it doing? And you know, it can be negative and positive. I see both, but Anyway, I just think like in order to make this democracy idea work, like we have to have some basic understanding of each other and some basic curiosity and respect, especially when we don't agree. And I think it's also helpful just to kind of think about our faiths shape us in all kinds of ways. Obviously, they shape what we think about theologically, but I think they also shape how we operate in the world. And, some faiths are more authoritarian than others. Some are more democratic than others. Some, have different ideas of what leadership looks like. Mm-hmm. And like to have more and more understanding of how those ideas operate, it just makes it possible for us to be community together.
I agree. That's one thing that I named when I was at Ebenezer, is that doing interfaith work, to me, speaks to the belongingness that we should all be able to tap into and experience. And I think interfaith work is a part of creating belonging just in the world. So thank you for naming what you've named, LeDayne. How does your spirituality, your faith inform how you lead in interfaith spaces and outside of those spaces?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I'll answer with a story that's you may have noticed that's kind of my go-to. So when I worked for the Baptist Peace Fellowship, which is the Baptist Peace Fellowship of North America, which is, and the member countries are Canada, the United States, Mexico, and Puerto Rico. And yes, I do know that Puerto Rico is technically a part of the United States, but in our work, we considered it its own nation. Two of those speak Spanish. And for the first 15 years I worked at the Baptist Peace Fellowship, everything we did was in English. Everything. Board meetings were in English. Emails were in English. Our annual conference was in English. And we kind of just started working on that a little bit around the edges when we were able to have our annual conference at a conference center, a retreat center outside of Mexico City. And we tried to do that for years and hadn't been able to find a location. And this retreat center where we'd had a board meeting at one point had contacted us to say, we talked when you were here about hosting your conference. And at that point we weren't big enough, but we've added a lot of space. We've added a lot of beds. We think we can do it now. And so for the first time in like I forget how old the organization was at that point, we had the conference in a Spanish speaking country. Mm-hmm. And our Mexican host had worked so incredibly hard, had spent so much money and so much time to make sure that every part of that conference was accessible for folks who spoke only English. So every word of the plenary sessions was translated. Every word of the workshops was translated. Everything in the program was in both languages. They thought really creatively about, well, what are the kind of things we can have in worship that don't require translation, like dance and movement. They had been so thoughtful and spent so much time and so much work to make us feel welcome in a way that, frankly, we had never done for them in reverse. And that was an incredibly transformative event for me, being the one who was welcomed and seeing what it felt like to experience that kind of hospitality and that kind of warmth and that kind of thoughtfulness. And it really transformed the organization. And that, like, we came back and we started implementing policies like board meetings have to be bilingual. Communication between board and staff has to be bilingual. For me, that meant using a lot of Google Translate because I don't, in fact, speak Spanish. We're not going to just stick this folks who don't speak whatever language is being spoken up front in the corner with a little, headset. We're going to think carefully about what good translation looks like. And And even like, this might sound like a small detail, but we had some board members who were perfectly fluent in English, but Spanish was their first language, and creating situations where they could speak in their first language and then be translated, right? So that, and it was fascinating.
At all. Yeah.
Yeah. And to see kind of like the emotion and that comes through, that doesn't come through when they're thinking in Spanish and speaking in English. And that was a really transformative experience when I took the work, when I took the job at MeckMIN, it was in part because I wanted to recreate that experience for folks in our society who aren't Christian, right? Because so much, Christianity, particularly Protestant Christianity, is just assumed, right? And it so permeates everything that we don't even think about it. So like sometimes we do education in workplaces, and sometimes, a workplace will say, we're religiously neutral. And I'm like, interesting. Do you have December the 25th off? And of course they do. It's also a federal holiday, but it's a federal holiday because we privilege one religion in this country. And so to be thoughtful, and I'm not going to say that we are anywhere close to where our Mexican hosts were, but to at least try to be thoughtful about what it looks like for a historically Christian country and a historically Christian part of the country that is still hugely Christian, right? To be really welcoming to folks who are something other than that, and creating that sense of belonging that you talked about earlier. So I don't know if that's my spirituality, but it is this thing that I experience that I long to recreate for other people. And it's hard. It's super hard because you can't see what you don't see, right? And most of us are formed in this, we're in the mainstream, and when you're in the mainstream, it's just hard to see what life might look like on the margins. But it's definitely my goal is to help us think about it, and to bring those moments where I have felt that deepening sense of belonging, and to remember how powerful and important that was, and to try to recreate that for other people in other situations. That's big.
That is big. It's one thing to have a personal transformational experience, and then another thing to translate that experience into something that other people can benefit from, in terms of recognizing how English is privileged because of the nature of colonization, and how it doesn't create equity for people of other countries who speak other languages. I think that's what true allyship is about. And you named so many good points of wisdom, particularly in the last answer you gave, which is helping me, LeDayne, think of not only Project 2025, but Project America. America that is a project, America that is an experiment. And we all get an opportunity to put our thing into the experiment and see what happens. So thank you for naming how your spirituality speaks to the way that you are.
Yeah. And I will add one thing, and I think this is definitely a spiritual grounding, is that it all has to happen in such an atmosphere of grace, right? Because we are going to mess it up.
Yes.
And especially those of us who have been who are part of the Christian mainstream, or part of the white mainstream, or whatever things that we have that are privileged. We're always going to be messing it up. This is a Baptist Peace Fellowship story, and it's kind of funny, but it's also revealing. I remember I was in my first year of work, and I emailed our board of directors and asked them to have something back to me by Thanksgiving. Well, in Canada, Thanksgiving is in October. And like, I immediately got 4 emails back from my Canadian board members saying, Thanksgiving has already happened. And so, and it was, it was in a atmosphere of like, there was humor and, but also like, yeah, like, let's not use that phrase again. But like, there had to be grace, right? Like, it had to be, in order for me to be able to say, yep, that was a US centric assumption that Thanksgiving is a thing that means something to everybody and it means the same date to everybody. But there has to be grace. And that was a small example. There have been, much more painful examples I could mention. And to be able to encounter one another in with both accountability and grace, right? I mean, I just don't feel like, I don't think any of us become better because even when we know internally that we've really messed up, I don't think we become better by being judged about that.
Yeah.
It has to happen in this kind of graceful way. And also just to say, we're gonna mess it up. We're gonna mess it up because we're part of a society that messes it up because we're just, we don't see what we don't see. And to be realistic that's the reality. And not be surprised when people bring it up. I mean, you've been involved with MeckMIN long enough to know that sometimes like somebody has to say, that wasn't okay, or that doesn't work for me, or that was offensive, or, and, trying to create a culture in which people feel okay speaking up and people feel okay hearing that and trying to make a change, all of those things. So that I think has to be the underlying spirituality is a spirituality of grace and forgiveness and accountability. Like, it's not like, it doesn't mean it's okay. It just means that it's expected. It's part of the human condition that we see things from our own perspectives.
I absolutely agree with you. Grace, accountability, and forgiveness are a part of relationship building generally, and particularly when it comes to this work of interfaith. And if we're continuing to move with this analogy of the project of America, any experiment that I did as a kid was messy. And so to have an expectation that as human beings who are being in dialogue across difference is going to be messy. And thank you for the invitation to extend grace to others as well as grace to ourselves in the work of creating more religious freedom in our world. When I want to go back to something that you mentioned, you were when you were a student at Duke Divinity School, you were going to a Southern Baptist church. Was it hard for you to make the transition from Southern Baptist to being ordained Alliance of Baptists? And what are the differences for those who might be
okay? So Baptist politics,
like, Baptist, how could she be doing all this work?
So I was a member. I mean, so this was the dates are important. So I was in Durham from 90 to 93, and that's a particular moment in Baptist life. And Watt Street Baptist at that point was both still Southern Baptist and American Baptist. So they were dually aligned. A lot of that has changed. It's become impossible for a church like Watt Street to still be Southern Baptist because they ordain women, if nothing else, for lots of other reasons as well. But so at that moment, they were both. And I have not been connected to a Southern Baptist church since then. And the churches that I have been connected to in my adult life, none of them are still Southern Baptist. Because they ordain women, because they're welcoming and affirming, because like they've taken on the work of racial justice. Like for all of these reasons, they're no longer Southern Baptist. But at the same time, like that that is what I was steeped in. I have to be cognizant of both the gifts and the challenges, the baggage. And it's interesting because on the one hand, like I own that, like I am really grateful that one of the keystone messages I got growing up in Southern Baptist churches was that I was beloved of God, right? That was a keystone identity, for which I'm grateful. At the same time, it was communicated to me in subtle ways that because my parents were divorced, because, I had stepbrothers, because, I was living with a stepfather, like we weren't really a family, right? And it was subtle. Nobody ever said that out loud. And then like there's that, and then kind of growing up and feeling a call to ministry, and many of my Baptist friends who are women in ministry have very similar stories, which is that we were very much educated that if God gives you a gift, God expects you to use it. And like, I don't know if you grew up hearing stories about these female missionaries who went off and, did all these things. That, we were steeped in those stories. And then when we began to have a sense that we had gifts for ministry, like those same churches were like, oh, no, not that. And I remember very clearly being, I went to seminary knowing that I wanted to do ministry, but not thinking I wanted to be a pastor, not thinking I wanted to be ordained. Certainly did not ever under any circumstances want to preach. And so I had to take a preaching class to graduate. And I put it off as long as I possibly could. And I finally did it. And this really bizarre thing happened to me, which was that everybody said I had a gift, including my professor. And I was like, no, I do not want this gift. Can I take it back and just, exchange it for a sweater or something? Because like, I knew that I just wasn't in a situation where that was going to be an easy gift to use. And so that was something that was really difficult. I also remember like being in college, and I had a church related ministry scholarship. It was $500 a year. But it was for students who were planning to go into ministry. And it was administered by the South Carolina Baptist Convention. And you had to have an internship every year. And so one year I was talking to the chaplain about what my internship was going to be. And I said, I haven't really worked with senior adults. I'd love to work with senior adults. Are there any of the internships that would like let me have that experience? And he's like, yeah, Christ Episcopal Church has this great program. They're looking for an intern. You'd be perfect for it. And so I was like, that sounds great. And so what I did is I worked with a person who was a perpetual deacon in the Episcopal system. So like in the Episcopal system, like there's levels of ordination, and some people become a deacon on their way to becoming a priest. And some people become a deacon, and that's their calling. That's where they want to stay. So this man was a perpetual deacon, and his role in the congregation was taking communion out to people who couldn't physically come to the congregation on days. And so I joined him. Like once a week, I would go with him and take communion out to elderly Episcopalians in Greenville County. And it was really it's a great experience. And so at the end of the year, I kind of doing my wrap-up interview with the Baptist convention, and like I still remember I go in and the woman has this folder and she looks and she goes, "Oh, you're our problem student." And I was like, "Really?" And she's like, "You're working in a Episcopalian church?" And I was like, "Wow, yes." And I explained, right, that I had wanted to work with senior adults and that this was the opportunity to allow me to do that. And she's like, "Okay, well, what if like you go to seminary and you get into ministry and no Baptist church would call you? Would you consider becoming a different denomination?" And I did this whole long thing of like, well, it would be really difficult and it would be really hard and I would hate to give this up. but yeah, I feel called to ministry. If that's what I would have to do, I would do it. And then she goes, but we're giving you all this money. It was like, so for $500 a year, you're gonna own my soul for all eternity? Like, it was just the strangest thing.
Wow.
And this isn't even interfaith. This is like Episcopalians, like, who are, in fact, Christian.
Right.
And it was such this bizarre experience of like, and I guess, looking back, it's another one of those experiences of like belonging and not belonging, and who belongs and who doesn't belong. And so yeah, like within a few years, it was super clear that none of us who felt that women experience calls to ministry could remain Southern Baptists. And so, like, that's like from the perspective of 2026, looking back and going, oh yeah, like that was, but at the time, it was deeply painful to have this denomination that had brought us up and nurtured us and taught us to say, no, we didn't mean you. It is, yeah. I mean, I've had this conversation with so many female Baptist friends of mine of like this, that weird thing of like, so often saying, if God has given you a gift, God expects you to use that gift, and then being told, but we didn't mean that gift for you here. So it's been an interesting journey.
There is somebody who might be listening that is having a similar experience right now, or someone that is thinking about what it means for them to let go of an inherited religious experience that is no longer working for them. How did you take care of yourself? If you could go back during that time, like, how did you heal through that, LeDayne? Because that could be traumatic for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Well, let me step back a second and say, like, I think that an important part of that journey is figuring out, like, what part of that tradition do you really want to hold on to? What were the gifts? I mean, you don't have to throw it out wholesale. But also, like, to use very Baptist language, if you feel there's a call on your life and it cannot be fulfilled where you are, then you really need to think about where can you be you, and the most authentic version of yourself. I think the way I took care of myself, I mean, I don't know that I've thought about it in those terms. It's just I was with other people who affirmed me and who affirmed me personally, and affirmed women in general. The Alliance of Baptists was a big part of that. The other, the Baptist Peace Fellowship was a great place to be a woman in ministry. And just friends and sharing stories with people who, came from similar backgrounds, similar tradition. I think those are the things that kept me from going nuts.
Yeah. Community is always important.
Yeah.
Being connected to others. And I can even have an appreciation for this woman that's talking to you about why you are involved in this Episcopalian ministry. Because there is this spirit of rightness and certainty that we all can live in that land. I know I certainly
sure.
I feel like I'm right about this thing or certain about this thing, but talking to people of other faiths and being someone who was exposed early on to people across faiths, there is a certainty that I've learned to let go of. When it comes to how people should be governing themselves in terms of how they interact with God, because it's just not mine to name. And I feel like the expansiveness of creation that we see out in the world, where we're thinking about the diversity of trees or plants or animals or fish, and just the concept that we would expect all humans to believe the same thing, think the same thing about God in particularly, just blows my mind. Even if we say that we are both Christians, it means different things, right? And so that is just sitting with me now, just the certainty and the rightness that many of us can operate in, and that keeps us from getting to know the other, whoever that other is. Yeah.
And we talk a lot, what are the big skills, mindsets for being able to do this work? And I've mentioned curiosity, I've mentioned respect. Humility is one of them too. I mean, recognizing that my way of being in the world is one way of being in the world. And it might be perfectly, absolutely 100% right for me, but it wouldn't be right for you. And as you say, giving up that certainty of rightness. And as I said, like, there really are times when I like to go to worship at my church on Sunday mornings, where I know that we have like a certain degree of agreement on things, like women in ministry, because we have a female pastor, and that's just not up for discussion anymore. So it is helpful to be able to be in those spaces. Sometimes those spaces have comfort, they have familiarity, they have, there's a gift to spend some of your time in spaces where you have some degree of agreement, but hopefully that's a comfort that allows us to then also be in other spaces.
Absolutely.
And to be in places where not everybody agrees that we're right.
Absolutely. I agree. As we wrap up this KYNDversation, KYND stands for knowing yourself in need of devotion. So when you think about the word devotion, LeDayne, what does devotion mean to you? And what are some of the devotional practices or spiritual practices that help you stay grounded, given what you do in the broader community?
Sure. So meditation has become very important for me. And I start and end most days. There's a great app called Insight Timer. And it has people from a lot of different perspectives. That's really key for me, to just quiet my mind enough to be able to function in the world. So that's big. And then my church, being involved, getting up on Sunday morning and going to worship. That's a spiritual practice. And then I really love reading. So, and and I do read actual spiritual stuff, but then also just I read a lot of fiction. And I read at some point that people who read fiction are more empathetic and more open to other ideas. And I think, and the idea is if you're constantly putting yourself in a narrator's shoes, and that narrator is different than you, it can be a really expansive experience. So I would say, reading, and then this will sound funny. This was not a spiritual practice that was taught to me growing up, but there are some podcasts I just really love. And I like to start my day, especially because I listen to all kinds of podcasts, and but I like to start the day with something that's kind of grounded, and not necessarily grounded in Christianity, but grounded, if that makes sense. And so that's something that I do that kind of helps me stay. Just helps me stay. We'll just say that.
Very good. That's good. And I dare not end this conversation without inviting you to talk about MeckMIN. What is
Oh,
MeckMIN
sure.
doing here in Charlotte? What is it, and why should people who might be interested in interfaith work get involved?
So I will tell a story because this story was just relayed to me, and it meant so much to me. So I was at the farmer's market. I ran into this woman that I know. She's involved at a local Episcopal church and has done several things with MeckMIN. And she's like, "Oh my gosh, do you have time for me to tell you a story?" I was like, "Sure." So she has a son. He's in college, and he participated a couple of years ago in our youth program, where during the summer we typically over 2 or 3 days, we visit various houses of faith. We do some service projects together. We have students who are coming from different faith perspectives. And the year that he participated, we visited, among other places, a Sikh Gurdwara. And she said that he had just really particularly resonated with that. I mean, if you want to experience hospitality, going to a Sikh Gurdwara is a great way to do it. There's no group of people who are better at hospitality than they are. And so anyway, but the story was that he had called her to say that he's part of a fraternity, and there was a new student wanting to pledge that fraternity who was Sikh. And some people may or may not know, Sikhs wear turbans. They're very distinct looking. You're not going to mistake him for a Christian. And some of the guys in the fraternity were a little uncomfortable because they just didn't know. And he was able to go, "Oh no, they are great." And he talks about this experience of visiting the Gurdwara and how welcome he was, and and is just able to kind of help them think about. He had such a positive experience. And I mean, it's one person, and yet, like, oh my gosh, that's huge. Because I imagine the story where he's not there,
Yeah.
and the brothers could convince themselves that this would be a mistake, that letting this person in who comes from this faith perspective that they're not familiar with, well, maybe that wouldn't work out so well. And then so here's, there's a young man who gets rejected, who gets turned away. Who knows what happens from there? But I'm sure he would have been fine. He would have found another space, but it would have been a deeply painful experience. And so I just love that story, in that, just the fact that he had that experience of being in the Gurdwara, being welcomed, having that experience of hospitality, and he was able to translate that into this experience in his life, where it took some courage, I think, to stand up and say, no, like, I actually know a little bit about this, let me tell you. So that's why people should be involved with MeckMIN, because it's like, it helps us. Another story I tell is like, February of 2025, right after the election, we had an open tables event, and I'll never forget, I'm sitting at a table, and there's a couple who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And there's a Muslim man, and the Muslim man is talking about how scared he is of changes in immigration policy, what's going to happen, is he safe, is his family safe? And the woman from the Latter-day Saints couple said, I just appreciate this so much, because without this conversation, it's just this thing that's happening on the news, right? So stories like that, help me see how important it is that we're able, that we have these connections. So we do all kinds of things, lots of ways. My little catchphrase is that, we have 12 different faiths that are connected to us. All of them have some version of that love your neighbor thing. And in the Sikh tradition, their scripture says, see no stranger. And the Quran says, I have made you different tribes that you might get to know one another. That idea of knowing and loving one another is common to all our faith groups. So, and I say, it's hard to love a neighbor that you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So all of our work is around helping people know and be known so that we can love and be loved. So we do it in lots and lots of different ways. Hop on the website, MeckMIN.org, and see what they are. We have dinners, we have service projects, we do education with clergy, we go into schools, and we go into workplaces. But it's all about like just knowing and being known by our neighbors.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, LeDayne, for explaining what MeckMIN is, what MeckMIN does, and how people can get involved. Make sure you go to that website, www.meckmin.org, to see what the organization has going on. And thank you all for tuning in to KYNDversation. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, where every episode goes live every Wednesday at 5 a.m. Remember, your life is sacred, your voice matters, and your becoming is holy. Until next time, stay devoted to the vine that's within you. Peace and abundant blessings.